API Conference, Elevating API Literacy.
SDKs are a good way for you to scale your product. And as we're talking about APIs, it makes sense for us to also think about SDKs, how you build your SDKs, especially when you want to build for a lot of people, right? Or SDKs. What I've tried to do here is to open the hood of what your SDK will be doing fundamentally. Now, if you just had APIs, you'll be working with this model here, where you had multiple APIs, and each API will be handling one aspect of your feature. So if I was a customer, I would need to integrate the first API, then integrate the second API, then integrate the third API, and as many APIs as necessary to complete my user journey. But on this end, you can see the issues with that kind of integration. So if I integrate the first one, it goes through, integrate the second one. What happens when the third one fails or the fourth one fails? And your customer is not going to listen to, oh, this is an issue with your provider, or this is an issue with another party. It's not coming from me, because there are multiple steps involved. So how do you solve this? Especially for you, the engineer who is trying to scale and get this across to many users. And the simple answer to that is to abstract it for them. And you abstract it by introducing an API. So they are calling the API methods, or the SDK methods, pardon me, right? This SDK handles all the multiple calls, does the abstraction for you. When it talks to the business, the core of your API, it gives them one response back. And then they don't need to worry about what's happening under the hood. So what I have here is just an idea of how long things take when it comes to integrating into your technology. On average, if I'm working with a no-code integration like a WordPress, I'm talking to a Wix. If I have your SDK, in a couple of steps, I'm done with the integration. It's just going to be a matter of copy your API keys, copy this, copy that, add this link, add this URL. And you don't need to be an engineer, or you don't need to be a product person to do that. So by doing this, you can basically take something very technical, your API, wrap it around, and distribute it to people who have no business talking to your APIs, and then still make revenues from them. If you were doing the integration on no code, it's going to take much longer, because you need to figure out authentication, you're going to figure out how I do my abstractions and all those things. Then if you're building your own custom application, on average, with an integration like Node or Java or any core library, you'll do it within a week, and then it takes longer than 3 weeks for you to get that done with custom integration. So let's talk about building our SDKs. Right. The first phase of properly building your SDK is to do research and to gather requirements. So what I'm going to try to do is to help us think about what are the right requirements, what are the right considerations that you need to make as an engineer, as a developer, even as a product manager. If you're going to if you're going to consult with your developers who are going to build this, what does that look like? What should they be thinking about? So the first and fundamental thing you want to do is think numbers. What do I mean? This API that I have, what is the most important thing for me? I want to make money. Mm-hmm. So if I'm thinking money, I'm thinking revenues. Mm-hmm. Where are the users? What platforms are they on? What languages are they using? What are the most popular frameworks that we need to build for and start with? I'm going to start for them. Then I'm going to think about user growth. What emerging technology is getting popular in the community? Do I want to pivot to a new framework? Do I want to build for something that is more legacy? You need to think about these things. And also, you want to think about your users' behaviors. And as funny as this sounds, this is where a lot of issues come from, because as a maintainer of that SDK, what happens really is that people can take your SDK and use it in a way that you didn't design it for. So you need to plan for that. How do my customers interact with it, even if they are not being rational? If they are going to be very extreme, what can they do with this thing? And how do I handle that kind of use case? And then you want to think about base requirements and custom requirements. What level of abstraction is my request and response going to have? What framework and language do I want to support on this SDK? And things like that. You also want to think about, do I want to abstract across multiple features? Or do I want to abstract per feature? What is that going to look like for me? And then I'm going to talk about a couple more custom requirements shortly. Then the last thing, basically an SDK is an abstraction. You can abstract a lot of things, but you need to draw the fine line when abstracting. How much abstraction do I want to do here? What things do I still want the developer to be able to customize? Or what things do I want the users to be able to customize? And then when you think through some of these things, you'd find answers that would help you come up with your base level requirements for your architecture. So let's talk about specs for your SDK. Do you want to build for one user, or do you want your SDK to support multiple users? Right. A good use case will be, if I am designing an SDK for an e-commerce platform or for a crowdfunding platform, that kind of SDK needs to be able to support multiple users at the same time. Because multiple users will be calling the endpoints, but it is one SDK that is interacting with that platform. So I need to think about how I'm going to support that. I also need to think about security. I'm sure we're going to talk extensively about security in the conference, but how am I encrypting data? How am I restricting access or giving access at different points in the SDK? What is important to me at that point is I need to make sure this SDK is as secure as the API itself, if not more secure. And then how do I handle errors? This is a place where you can make or break your SDK, because when people interact with the APIs, one key area that is not really described in the API functionality itself is error and error handling. Different people handle errors differently. So you want to help the developer here handle errors. How do you handle user errors? How do you handle the API errors that come up during processing? How do you want to handle your retry? Do you even want to retry certain things in your SDK? These are things that you need to answer. And then you need to come up with your own custom error codes that makes it predictable when people are using your SDKs. Finally, you want to think monitoring. What kind of data do you want to collect from your customers? What kind of data do you want to collect from your users? What kind of log do you want to send to the platform that is going to do your tracking for you? How do you design that log? What level of logging do you want to have? How do you get consent from your customers, right? Because it's important for you to get consent before you start collecting data from your users, else it becomes a compliance issue. So you need to think about, how do I get consent? What tools am I going to use to log all this data? And finally, there are some auxiliary processes that are just important to think about. Like, do I want to log the response directly to the user's database? Do I want to use an OEM, for example, to do that? Do I want to have a registry for all the endpoints within the SDK? Is this something that I want to have utility functions like validators? Do I want to have a utility function for authenticating across the SDK? These are some things that would guide your specs and your designing for the SDK. So after you've done, the requirements gathering, you've gathered the requirements, you've asked yourself, how can I get this data? What do I do here? How do I get this spec? And you've listed all your specs. You need to start to design. I have 3 different pictures here. You might not be able to see the one on the left well, but this is a sequence diagram. Basically, you start from the beginning, like you are inside the request that the developer is making, and then you go through the process. Before it hits your endpoints, what needs to happen? What happens after it hits the API endpoint? Where are the breaks in the road? Where are the logics that could come up? and you basically design the sequence from the beginning to the end. Now, this is important because when you take your specification and you are designing, you can start to see limitations and you start to make the decisions when it comes to trade-offs. Do I want to trade off speed for security? Do I want to trade off, telemetry for utility functions within the SDKs? This is where it starts to become clear and you start to make that decision. Then when you're done with that, you go to the components diagram, right? If you want to learn more about this, you can just Google C4 model. It's really helpful for architecting because when you're done with the sequence, you start to see similarities. You start to see components that jump at you, and you need to design these components. Who are they talking to? What does each component do? Who is depending on these components within the system, outside the SDK, and all of that? And then you have the class diagram where you design, the classes within each component, how they interact with themselves, and all of that. So let's talk development now. When developing, these are just some things to have in mind, right? We're not going to talk about how you develop. I'm sure everybody has their own different style of development, but there are some things you need to have in mind if you're going to be able to properly build SDKs that can help you scale. The first thing is don't skip design phase. No matter the pressure, you have to do the design. It's very important. You can't skip the design phase because without that design that you've done, you don't have clarity on implementation, you don't have clarity on trade-offs, you don't know the pitfalls to watch out for within the context of the system that you are designing and the SDKs that you are designing also. So you want to have your architectural diagrams, you want to have your container diagrams, you want to have your C4 model in place, have all your specification in place before you even start development. Then it's also important to talk to your users. I know we're developers and we've been talking technical all morning, but when building, you're building for somebody. And if you're going to build for businesses that would scale, it makes sense for you to get feedback from some of the people that are going to use this thing in the end. So get that feedback early, get it as often as you can. You also want to make your library open source. It's difficult to maintain a library when you've put it out there because you want to build a lot of libraries, you have a lot of features, a lot of things are going on. You want to open source it, make sure that you establish standards for how you build, how you get contributions, how you handle your issues, all of that. And then you want to automate the process when it comes to contributions to your libraries as much as possible. So your deployment pipeline, you want to automate that. You want to automate your review process. You want to automate how you check issues, what issues should be prioritized, and all of that. And finally, don't lie to yourself, right? As developers, we want to be superheroes. We want to be Superman. If it's going to take you 2 months, it is 2 months. Because the moment you rush and you tell yourself, oh, boss, I'll do this in 3 weeks, when you know it's 2 months, you start to have issues. It becomes difficult for you to properly build something that scales. And the beauty about SDKs is they can help you scale or they can mess you up, right? Because people will see these issues and call them out for what it is. So pretty much, I think that's all I wanted to share this morning. I have a bit of time for Q&A. I don't know if you can get another mic to just get questions from the audience.
API Conference, Elevating API Literacy.